Morning, Kristen. How are you?
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you to the Humboldt Coastal Resilience Project meeting today. We really appreciate you all for joining us. Okay, our agenda for today, we have a brief introduction about this project from Susie Fortner from Friends of the Dunes and Sue Corbley from the State Coastal Conservancy. Then we have 3 presentations on important aspects of this project from the project team, which includes Jeff Anderson from Northern Hydrology and Engineering, Andrea Pickart from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Ian Walker from UC Santa Barbara. Each of them will give 15-minute presentations, and then we'll have a really brief Q&A after each presentation. And then we'll end our meeting with an overview of some of the recommendations that are coming out of this project, as well as next steps. If we do have time at the end of this meeting, we'll open it back up for additional questions. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with Zoom, but just a reminder, you can, during our Q&A sessions, you can raise your hand using the reactions button, or you can type your questions in the chat and we can read them out. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. If not, this session is recorded and we'll have a list of everyone's questions, so we're hoping we can address them after the presentation. We also please ask that you stay on mute throughout this presentation unless we call on you to ask a question. I'll turn it over to Susie.
All right. Hat wat lao, everyone. That is greetings or hello in the Wiyot language, Salatlak. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the lands we inhabit and the environments we work to conserve are located in the unceded territory of the Wiyot people, which includes the Wiyot tribe, Bear River Rancheria, and Blue Lake Rancheria. Wiyot people continue to be stewards of the coastal environment surrounding Wigi, the Humboldt Bay, as they have been since time immemorial, including Wadach, the coastal dunes. We seek to honor and respect the role of Indigenous people, both past, present, and as well as future generations in stewarding these lands. On your screen now, you'll see a list of project partners, and there are a lot of them, so I'm not going to name them all off. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Susie Fortner. I'm the Programs and Operations Director with Friends of the Dunes. We are the fiscal sponsor of these grants, and we've got some great presentations from some of our other project partners coming up today, but it's a big list of people. So thank you to everybody who's been involved over the years. So the Humboldt Coastal Resilience Project is a coastal dune and vulnerability and adaptation assessment with a goal of increasing Humboldt County's capacity to develop resiliency measures and prepare for sea level rise through existing planning and regulatory structures. Our project area is the Eureka Littoral Cell, which you will hear more about during our presentations today. But that is the stretch of coastal sand dunes from Little River Beach in the north to Centerville Beach in the south. This project is focusing on the beach dune barrier system, which is our outer coastline. It does not include the inner bay, though there has been a lot of great sea level rise work done on the inner bay already. Next slide. Great, I'll turn it over to Sue Corbley next.
Sorry, Sue, can you unmute yourself?
Of course I can. Thanks. Thanks, Susie and Kristen. My name's Sue Corbley. I am the grant manager with the State Coastal Conservancy who has obtained and provided funding for the project. I'm going to give a little bit of just a very brief history of the project from the Conservancy's first involvement. So the project began as the Dunes Climate Ready project, and research began in earnest with funding awarded to the Friends of the Dunes from the Conservancy in our very first round of Climate Ready grants in late 2014, with funds from BLM, Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The 3-year grant involved conducting analysis for shoreline data to look at shoreline changes since 1939. It established transects along the Eureka littoral cell and collected semi-annual dune profile measurements. It established one pilot restoration adaptation site to contrast and compare geomorphic response of restored dunes to dunes that had not yet been restored. It conducted public outreach to keep public informed of work and progress on the project. And then work continued with an additional lump of funding under the Humboldt Coastal Resilience Project. In 2017, the Conservancy received a grant from the USC Sea Grant Program, and in 2018, we awarded those funds and Conservancy matching funds to Friends of the Dunes to continue the adaptation and geomorphic response study. That effort created 2 more pilot adaptation sites, one on the North Spit and one at the Eel River Dunes. It developed a vulnerability assessment to analyze risk along the Eureka littoral cell, and it updated the sand budget for the littoral cell to look at sufficiency of supply over time. Next slide, please. That effort also included public outreach, which is ongoing still and will continue. And outreach and agency involvement has been very important part of this project. And you can see just briefly a list of agencies and general public efforts that have been undertaken. And Friends of the Dunes led the effort to organize and conduct those outreach efforts. Thanks. Back to Susie.
Thanks, Sue. So the objectives of this phase of the project, the Humboldt Coastal Resilience Project, include continuing to collect shoreline data, testing adaptation strategies, updating the sediment budget for the Eureka littoral cell, completing a vulnerability assessment, evaluating barrier responses to sea level rise and storm events, engaging and sharing results with our coastal land managers, agencies, and local decision makers, and community outreach, which these last 2 tasks continue to be ongoing.
Great, thank you, Susie and Sue. So with that, we're going to transition to our project presentations that address some of those first objectives. And we'll begin with Jeff Anderson. He can take over screen sharing.
There it goes. It's gonna take me a minute to get everything set up, so.
Looks like it's in presentation mode for us, Jeff.
Okay, thanks. I gotta get a little pointer here. All right, so can folks see the red dot?
Yep.
All right, so here we go. Hi, I'm Jeff Anderson, and I need to give a call out to Brian Buchanan, who I think's on the call, but he's from our office, and he did a lot of the heavy lift on this project in terms of calculating river loads and compiling a lot of the records. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. Are the general products that we delivered in terms of the sand budget is, as you heard, we updated the sand budget to address uncertainty that came up. We conducted this in a Monte Carlo simulation framework. Some of the key deliverables were to develop what we'll call time-dependent riverine sand loads, and I'll discuss some of this in more detail. We developed some long-term riverine sand and gravel extraction volumes, long-term record of Humboldt Bay dredging, and we developed a long-term relative sea level rise rate curve for the littoral cell. I do have a number of slides where I'm not going to talk about all the information. I packed a lot into some of these slides so folks can review them. And this is one of them. So our sand budget in its simplest form, a sand budget or sediment budget is just input minus output equals change in storage. For this sand budget, we followed the Corps of Engineers sand budget equation. We just use their nomenclature and their definitions for primarily for transferability into the future. A few items I want to spend a little more time on this slide. So as you heard Susie mention, The Eureka littoral cell stem goes from Trinidad Head down to False Cape. And for this sand budget, what we're assessing is what we call beach sand. So that's sand that you would see if you were walking on the beach. And it tends to be, for our area, sand greater than 0.125 millimeters. We're not looking at any material or considering material finer than this, like silt, clay, or really fine sands. For this sand budget, we developed 10 separate compartments, split into what we're calling inputs and outputs. So for the input sides, we're looking at sand loads from 9 rivers that flow into the littoral cell. And we're going to talk about these in both a static and time-dependent load. We've also are addressing bluff erosion, which primarily occurs in the south end. And we've also looked at how and when they place, where they placed previous dredge material placement. So prior to 1990, dredge placement was placed south of the entrance, and it was placed inside of what we're calling the littoral cell. After 1990, they took dredge material out of the bay and they placed it outside of the littoral cell at hoods. And then looking at the sinks or the change in storage components, we addressed this blue line as what we're defining as the shoreline. And there we looked at the change in volume of sand on the shoreline, and then also how much sand is lost over time due to sea level rise. This big green polygon is what we're defining as the inner shelf, and we looked at the change in storage on the inner shelf. We've also looked at the amount of sand that's needed in our estuaries, some of the larger estuaries, to offset sea level rise. We looked at the volume change of sand in the dunes, and then we also looked at river sand gravel extraction, and also the dredging of sand out of Humboldt Bay. I'm going to go over a few of the key inputs, and just in terms of some of the results we found in those. So as a lot of you are aware, Humboldt Bay has the highest rate of sea level rise in the state. And in early 2023, Jay Patton kind of took the lead, and we published some of our local science and kind of provided these local, kind of our locally generated sea level rise and vertical land motion rates. And the thing that I really want to point out here is we have a real strong north to south gradient in what we call relative sea level rise. And when you starting near Trinidad, it's approximately 3 millimeters per year, and as you move south, we start going over 6 millimeters per year, and that difference is driven by a different vertical land motion rate. So we have lower vertical land motion, which is all sinking up here, and we have much higher vertical land motion rates down here. The plot right here is, once again, this is done in a Monte Carlo simulation framework. So when you mash all this information together, you can generate this. This is like an average relative sea level rate for the littoral cell. And if you just focus on this black line, it just gives us information. Like in the early 1900s, we were already near approximately 4 millimeters per year sea level rise rate. And today, for the littoral cell on an average rate, we're over 5. And we'll use this curve in the analysis. I got ahead of myself here just a sec. All right, so the purpose of this slide is to just demonstrate 2 approaches for determining riverine sand loads. The red curve is the red line, excuse me, are the annual sand loads when you assume suspended sediment concentrations do not vary in time, right? It's kind of the common approach we've used for a lot of years in terms of defining river loads. The blue line is what is the annual loads when we consider or we allow sediment concentrations to vary through time. And I'm just going to let everybody know, for our local rivers, sediment concentrations have varied throughout time. And just to kind of show what that does, if you look at this table, the first row are what we're going to call time-dependent sediment loads, sand loads. And this is when we're allowing sediment concentration to vary in time. And the middle row here, what we call time static, is when we just hold concentrations constant. And what you can see is over the period, this period from 1911 through 2018, the time-dependent rating curve is about 25% less than if we assume the static, the sort of the time static approach. And that's just indicating that, you know, there's less sand probably entering our littoral cell with using this time-dependent approach than this historic time static approach. These are just sort of 10-year records. Starting in 65 through 76, for example, the time-dependent actually produced quite a bit more sediment than the time static curve, and then it's slowly been decreasing over time. And when you get in the last 20 years, we're probably looking at about 50% less sand today when we allow the suspended sediment concentrations to vary through time. All right, this is another busy plot, but what we're trying to do here is to show the effects of river sand and gravel extraction, and then our bay sand dredging efforts. The green line is our river sand, our annual kind of river sand extraction. And it peaked in the 1960s, 1970s, and then it's slowly been decreasing over time. This blue line represents the county manages gravel extraction now. It's called CHIRP program that started in probably right around 1992, I believe. And you can see that over time since then, the river extraction has been held fairly constant and quite a bit lower than what it was historically. The red line represents the dredging in Humboldt Bay over time. Prior to 1999, roughly, the bay dredging, you know, was kind of held fairly constant. There was a deepening project that started in 1999, and essentially 1999 forward, dredging basically doubled. Now the black line represents what happens when you sum these two together. And the red dash line, or sorry, the black dash line is kind of a 10-year average. And the interesting thing to note here is that going all the way back to 1960, when you combine these two extractions, it's been held relatively constant over time. And looking back since about 2000, the last 20 years, we've been removing about 1.4 million cubic yards of beach sand a year from the bay, and through dredging in the bay and through river sand extraction. Approximately 20%, or about 300,000 cubic yards, is coming from river extraction, and the rest, 80%, or close over 1 million yards per year, is through bay dredging. All right, so I'm going to go through a few of the sand budget results now. We did 2 different sand budgets. The first one was for a period from 1966 to 2001. And the reason we chose that period is we had information on 9 of the 10 compartments I talked about earlier. The only information we didn't have for this period was the volume, how the dune volume changed through this period. So what we did is we essentially just solved this equation for dune volume. And I'm going to present, the next few slides are just ways to look at these results. And some of these are just so folks can go back and review, but this is sort of a tabulated result. The inputs are up in here, and the sources and sinks and volume changes are down in this part of the table. These are mean volumes, 95% confidence intervals around the mean, and then this column just gives percent change over time. And this is just a schematic. You often see this in the literature. So the box is a control volume that just talks about this is the littoral cell. Inside of it are our change in storage terms and whether we're removing or placing material in the cells. And then the areas are just the arrows, are just representing inputs and outputs. One thing I do want to talk about is our dune growth or our dune volume change. We didn't have information for that, and we solved for it. So, and then just quickly, that volume term turns out to be, for this period, 1966 to 2001, was about 514,000 cubic meters per year. And if we used approximately 51 kilometers of dune length. That gives us a number of about 10 cubic meters per meter per year. And I looked into a couple literature, just a quick literature review, and that number kind of falls into the range of values I found in the Shore Protection Manual from the Corps, and also something that we're up in Oregon through publication. So backing into this number and coming, it seems like it's a reasonable result of the sand budget for this period. This is a slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I have a simpler one to discuss, but this is a slide that just shows the 10 different compartments. Blue is inputs, the brown are the known outputs, and the red is the dune component that we solve for. These are just bar charts showing the means, and the bars represent the 95% confidence intervals. What this plot did, what I did is I just basically combined the dredging and extraction into one component, and I combined both shoreline components into one. It just makes it a little bit easier to discuss and to understand. But the key takeaways from this are, the dominant input is obviously the river loads into the littoral cell. About 90% of the material coming in, the sand coming in, comes from all of our rivers and streams and creeks. From the output side, dredging and extraction of sand is equivalent, it's essentially the same as the amount of sand that was put on that inner shelf component, that delta change. Both of these components are larger than the amount of sand that went into the shoreline or into the dune for this period. I'm looking at my notes here, make sure I don't skip something.
Jeff, you have about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Oh man, I'm behind. Okay. So the key takeaway here is that, dredging and the gravel extraction are significant components of the sand budget. And I think that's been not well defined or understood historically. All right, I got to really fly now. So we also looked at a temporal sand budget for the period 1911 through 2018. We did not have all the terms available. So what we looked at we included terms that we knew. So we had our time-dependent river loads. We knew our dredging and sand gravel extraction volumes, where that material was placed. And then what we did is we looked at just the volume of sand needed to offset sea level rise for the shoreline, inner shelf, and estuaries. If there's a positive residual, so we change this around and solve for residual. If we have a positive residual, it means that we have sand available for the shoreline and dune growth. And if it's negative, it means that we don't have, there's not enough sand being delivered to keep pace with sea level rise. So, and part of this expectation is that a long-term negative residual could be an indicator of some sort of shoreline or dune recession or some change to the system. So really quick, the line in the background gray line are the annual residuals, and you're either going to get a positive surplus or you're going to get a deficit. The red line is the 10-year moving average, and these light red is the 95% confidence interval band. What you see is there was minimal input during this period right in here, but even with some of the assumptions we made, you can see that things were fairly, from a residual standpoint, we're basically in balance. There really wasn't a surplus or a deficit. But beginning in around the 1960s, we started to get this surplus of sand that was in the system. And we ran this positive residual, continued into about 1990, which happens to coincide when we started to take material to hoods. In other words, we did sand disposal outside of the littoral cell. From about 1990 to 2000, it sort of was just trumping along at, kind of in balance. And then with the deepening project, ever since the deepening project in 2000, we've been running this negative deficit. One of the things I wanted to compare is what would happen if we hadn't taken the material to hoods and instead just kept the sand disposal within the littoral cell, which was what we did prior to 1990. And if I toggle back and forth, you can kind of see the difference. Essentially, we would have maintained a positive residual of sand up until about mid 2000s. And then it looks like it would have stayed after the deepening project, kind of in a state of, you know, basically bouncing back and forth, but near zero. All right, this is the last slide. This is a plot showing the cumulative volume residual. What that does is it just takes this residual term and just sums it over time. And what you see is beginning in about the 1960s, and the brown is sort of existing conditions. We see that we've had this large accumulation of sand. We've had a large sand surplus building in our littoral cell since about the 1950s, beginning around 1990, and then really taking off in the year 2000. We start to see that there's been this long, kind of drawn out, it's still a surplus, but we're starting to eat away with that surplus. And that is primarily, you know, what we're seeing is this appears to be driven by disposal of hoods, and then and it's also tied to the deepening project. The green line is what would happen, this green in the back, if we had kept the material in the littoral cell. And so this difference here is probably a pretty good representation of how much sand is sitting out at hoods right now. So the last slide is, you know, the processes affecting the littoral cell sand budget are essentially riverine sand loads have decreased over time. You know, the management decision to place dredge sand at hoods, our river gravel extraction, but I do want to say CHRT does a really good job of managing sand gravel extraction, and then of course our high relative sea level rise rates are affecting the sand budget. That's it.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So we have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has a question, you can add it to the chat or use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. Hey, Justin, feel free to unmute yourself.
I just had a question about the sand river extraction. Is that commercial use, like for sale?
Yes.
Is there a main river, or like all of them equally?
They're the primary extraction. Well, there's three. There's the Eel River, the Van Dusen River, and the Mad River. And that's where, you know, there's permits for there's a number of commercial operators that extract off of various gravel bars.
Thanks, Justin. We have a question in the chat from Alderon. Has the type of and volume of timber harvest affected these rates?
How long do I have to answer that question?
A minute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There we go. Let me just go back to one slide. I might be this slide. I know I really breezed through this in a rather, unfortunately, chaotic way, but yeah, timber harvest, you know, really kicked in our area beginning in about after World War II. So around 1955, 60s is when we really started to see harvest rates accelerate in our local watersheds. And unfortunately, coincidentally, however you want to look at it, it also from, you know, starting in the mid 50s through pretty much the 80s, we had a number of high rainfall runoff events, 64 flood being the one. And yeah, we had, you know, probably due to land use practices, significant landslides, sediment concentrations really shot up during this period right in here, which coincidentally produced a lot of sediment from our rivers. since about late 70s, 80s, concentrations have been decreasing over time. A lot of that has to do with natural recovery and new, timber harvest management, our best management practices.
Okay, great. Jeff, we've gotten a couple more questions in the chat, but we're gonna stop here, transition. If we have time, we'll get back to these questions. So if you are able to stop sharing your screen, we will change and get Andrea ready to present.
Yeah, hi, I'm Andrea Pickart, the ecologist at Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And I'm going to be talking today about 3 components of the research under those grants: the shoreline change analysis, our cross-shore transects, and our climate adaptation sites. So starting with the shoreline change analysis, these I'm showing here 2 reports that are available. The one on the left is done by GHD and covers the south end of the littoral cell. And the one on the right covers the north, and it was that research was done by Kelsey McDonald. The way this is done is historic air photos are georectified, and then the shorelines over different time periods are digitized, and then they're put together and added into a software program called DSAS, which calculates the rate of the regression rate of the shoreline change. So this is what the results look like. This is up at Clam Beach, and the color of the arrows denotes the amount of change, and the arrows themselves denote the direction of change. So you can see that in this whole northernmost area of our littoral cell, we had a lot of shoreline progradation or growth during the period 1939 to, I think it went to 2016. So this is a long view of shoreline change, multi-decadal. Just another example, this is down in an area by Samoa, and you can see that there are no arrows here. So this was an area that showed no statistically significant change in the shoreline position. But down here, just north of the North Jetty, we had very high erosion of the shoreline over that period. South Spit showed moderate accretion, and then the map on the left is summarizing it's not constant over the whole littoral cell. You can see that we had the highest accretion in the north, we had moderate in the center, and then very high erosion at the North Spit, and then medium accretion in the South Spit. And on the right, these are the north and south parts of the Eel River barrier, which in the north we showed moderate accretion, and in the south we showed moderate erosion. So then I'm going to shift to looking down on a much finer time scale. So this is 5 years of data, so half of a decade, and we're looking at it more specifically on the ground. This is a map showing all of our transects. We had 72 transects along the whole littoral cell. And along these transects, we collected RTK GPS elevation data. The woman holding the pole is Candace Reynolds, who oversaw a lot of the field work for this. We collected elevation at 1 to 2 meter intervals and vegetation data in the same places. This was done twice a year, in the winter and the summer, for the whole 5 years. So these are the results, and I'm summarizing them here and showing you the beginning profile of the dunes in the dotted line in the first summer of the survey, and the final profile in the solid line. And that would be the last summer that we surveyed. So this is up at Little River. I don't know if you remember, but when I showed you the historic trends, this was an area of very high accretion. So that didn't really show so much in this in our 5-year transects. It does show a positive sediment budget. In this case, when I say sediment budget, I'm talking about the dune sediment budget. And that's just a measure of the amount of sand coming into the dunes versus leaving the dunes. So for a positive sediment budget allows for a resilient response. So this particular area does show a resilient response. And this is down at Clam Beach. And similarly, it's not hugely dramatic, but shows a positive sediment budget and a resilient condition. Now, if we go farther south, down below the mouth of the Mad River, we have some pretty high, steep Ammophila-dominated foredunes. And these all were erosional. And the one on the bottom showed a shoreline retreat of about 15 meters, which is pretty significant. So this is an area that got a negative sediment budget and not showing indications of resiliency. Farther down at the Lanphere adaptation site, this is where we took the vegetation off Ammophila and planted native species, or took Ammophila off the dunes, planted native species. And you can see in the top one that we actually, well, in both of them, we had a broadening of the foredune, and the sand was deposited on the rear or lee side of the foredune. So the sediment budgets here were positive and moving inland. This is a representative graph for the Lanphere area, which was all restored back in the 90s. In this area, we had these incipient foredunes, which are these small foredunes in front of the established foredune. These are ephemeral features that usually last on the order of 5 years, and then they're washed away. We did have 2 big storms during the period of our monitoring, and we were able to observe how the foredune responded to that. And you can see from this graph that although we lost the incipient foredune, it actually moved the sand up to the top and the crest of the foredune. So although it's a fairly neutral sediment budget, it's a resilient response. And same with the Malel, the Fish and Wildlife Service Malel area. For incipient foredune lost, but deposition on the front and the top of the foredune, so also resilient. This is Malel South, the BLM property. This acted a little differently than some of the other areas. There didn't tend to be an incipient foredune in these areas, and one was formed during this study. So that's indicating a positive sediment budget and a resilient condition. The Friends of the Dunes property, you can see the high steep narrow foredune created by European beach grass. And there was an incipient foredune in front of that at the start of the study. That foredune washed away, but unlike the transects to the north, the sand did not move up onto the foredune. So this was a neutral or negative budget and a not very resilient condition. We're skipping down to Samoa Pacific because it had a pretty dramatic change. This was an area that we saw shoreline retreat. So there was erosion and no deposition. In the bottom graph, we lost about 30 to 40 meters of shoreline. And the end of the transect on the right, which is the inland end of the transect, is right close to where New Navy Base Road is. So that this is kind of a serious condition for infrastructure. The city of Eureka also has showed shoreline retreat. The South Spit had tended to have a neutral sediment budget. This was a restored area. The first one was unrestored, neutral. And then the Eel River North Barrier showed a fairly neutral sediment budget. It was of interest that there was a lot of large wood that helped build up the foredune after the storms in these areas. And then down on the Wildlands Conservancy property, we had a lot of erosion during those storms that didn't recover. The bottom graph shows that the foredune was completely breached, and the sand was deposited back in a overwash van behind the beach. So this is now a beach berm. And then way down at Centerville, there was no foredune when we started the project. It had already been washed away. So what we're seeing here in this northern one is this is a beach berm. We're showing retreat of the beach and shoreline. So this was our most vulnerable area in the study site.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, so we had two adaptation strategies. The first was to test the hypothesis that native dune building plants increase resilience to sea level rise. That's the location of our adaptation site. We took an area dominated by European beach grass, removed it, and planted a combination of native dune grass and dune mat. Then during this process, over a course of 5 or 6 years, the elevation of the site was measured using terrestrial laser scanners or scanner. That was the property of Ian Walker's lab, and this is his PhD student, Zach Hilgendorf. The way that you read the results of these scans is you subtract an older collection from a newer collection, and you can see areas of deficit and deposit. This is what the whole area looked like over the entire course from November 15th, 2015 to September 2021. So you're looking at the different planting areas, and then this is the control that was just Ammophila. The way to read this is that red is erosion and blue is deposition. And we did have a lot of sediment leave the beach in that first storm and never completely recover, but I want to focus your attention on the dunes, which are back here. This black line is the crest of the foredune, and you can see that in all of the restored areas, there's deposition both on the front of the foredune and especially behind the crest. So this had all been tied up in European beach grass, all this sediment on the front of the foredune, and it was able to move. In contrast, on the Ammophila segment, you can see that almost all of the deposition was just on the front of the foredune. So this was the scarping that happened as a result of the first storm that we had. And we were able to measure the change in the foredune in response to that storm. Foredunes repair from scarping by building up a sand ramp that eventually reaches the top of the scarp, and then the sand budget is reconnected. And how that looks in a schematic and how that relates to resiliency, if you have two foredunes, the one on the left is native and they're both the same height, and you get a scarping, but they're different widths because the native foredunes tend to be broader. You get a scarping event, and a much greater proportion of the beachgrass foredune is lost than in the broader native foredune. Then the ramp starts to build up, and it's building up faster on the native foredune than the beachgrass foredune. And the native foredune recovers while the invaded one still has a ramp. Now, let's say a second storm occurred, which did happen. You're back to just a proportionately small amount of the native foredune being lost, whereas the invaded one, since it hadn't recovered, is retreating even further back, and there's danger of losing the foredune altogether. The second adaptation strategy was more of a stopgap measure to see what we could do about the dunes that were eroding down at the Wildlands Conservancy. So we created a foredune in an area where the foredune had blown out, been washed away. That was before, and this is after. These are the surface change maps. So this shows the addition of the foredune and the removal of the sand to make it. And this shows between October 28th and May 2023 that the foredune completely eroded, and there was more deposition back in that area. This is what it looked like from the air. That's the breach right there. This is with the artificial foredune. And then that's following a major storm, not just the area of the built foredune, but a much larger area eroded. So this is not, we're not considering this to be a viable adaptation strategy. I don't know if I have time for questions.
Yes, you're perfectly on time. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. Go ahead, David.
I'll jump in since nobody else is. First, thanks for that presentation. That was fascinating. For me, it felt like drinking from a fire hose, though, so I may have really misunderstood. But what it seemed like is the Ammophila in some places really destabilized and made the dunes less resilient. But then in other places, it didn't seem to have that same impact. And so I'm wondering if I got that right, and if so, how you think that relates to the study that you just talked about, where it did seem to have a much pronounced impact relative to native species.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that contribute to the erosion. The vegetation on the dune doesn't actually affect the scarping very much. It affects the healing or ramping. What affects the scarping, in addition to the storm waves, can be, conditions of, rip tides in some areas, wider beaches in some areas. So there's going to be variation in what you see as a response. But when we had side-by-side identical conditions, you could see that the Ammophila foredune wasn't able to heal in near the time. It took two additional years to heal compared with the native foredune. I hope that answered your question.
Awesome. Thank you, David. We have 2 questions in the chat. The first is from Aldron. Is the breach at Centerville an example of spit migration in response to sea level rise?
Well, I'm not sure I would call it spit migration because it's not a spit. I would call it an example of a dune responding to sea level rise, yes.
Great. And then we have another question from Ken. Presumably the shoreline retreat just north of the bay mouth is a product of the jetties, ?
Yes, that would be the obvious cause, although it's interesting that we, in our 5-year study, saw actual shoreline gain in that area, and it had been tracking erosion for quite some time. The Corps of Engineers was looking at it, but we found much more erosion just to the north. So that's an example of how the other factors can contribute to where the erosion is happening.
Thank you. Time for maybe one last question. Okay, one from Marissa. Regarding the site near McNulty Ocean Ranch, you said the wood helped the foredunes remain neutral. Is wood addition at some of these sites another potential remediation method?
Yeah, I guess you could look at that as a remediation. It definitely did help the foredune build on those sites. That's naturally dispersed wood after the large storms. But yeah, possibly.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. And we will transition now to our last presentation from Ian.
Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, I can't seem to find my little laser pointer, so I hope you can see my little arrow. First, this is, as you saw in the introduction, the culmination of nearly a decade worth of work from quite a team of folks. And I want to thank everyone who's been involved in collaborating on the team. I also want to thank those of you in the audience who've been engaged and interested in this work. This is really important for local communities. And I think it's a good example of research to action that is sort of the new pulse of what we do as academics and what other practitioners are doing to bring the science to action. I also want to give a shout out to Laura Shinsato, who's in the audience today. Laura was an MS student of mine when I was at ASU, and she's now a research associate here at UCSB. And Laura is really the one behind the vulnerability assessment. It was her master's thesis, and as you'll see, it's quite a piece of work. I don't know if I could advance my slides, which I can't seem to do. Oh my goodness. I can't advance my slides. I guarantee you there are more slides. Let me just try something here. Okay, there we go. So as you heard earlier, this is our study reach, the shores of the Eureka littoral cell, and these 13 reaches were the shoreline segments that we analyzed for the vulnerability assessment. And they were chosen based on historic shoreline erosion trends and the profile responses in geomorphology that Andrea spoke about earlier. Oh, I've lost my... I can't advance my slide again. Okay, goals of the assessment then specific to this. So this is objective 4 of the broader project. We wanted to collect a series of variables, 22 in total, that describe not only the environmental and biological aspects of vulnerability, but also socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And then we wanted to group those together in different ways to provide different interest groups, different perspectives on vulnerabilities. So I think that's an important take home up front here, is that it's not just one single vulnerability. There are many of them. And depending on your interests, then this method should help you tease that out in different levels of aggregation. And then of course, we roll those together as is traditional for an overall comprehensive vulnerability assessment. This is another fire hose. I apologize. There's going to be lots of variables and lots of maps in this talk, but please bear with me. You're going to see this table throughout the talks. These are the list of the 22 variables or data sets that we were able to capture. And then these steps 1, 2, and 3 are the different vulnerability assessments. And they're grouped thematically into physical vulnerabilities, biological, natural hazards, sociocultural, and infrastructure. And then those roll up into socioeconomic and environmental that combined give us a comprehensive overall picture of vulnerability. So again, we've got these 22 variables. They're rolled up in 3 levels of vulnerability to a comprehensive assessment. The data sets were in all different shapes and sizes, as you can imagine. And these were collated into spatial data sets on a 100 meter or about 330 foot grid or transects across all of these reaches. And then vulnerability scores were assigned. And the initial results, which some of you have seen in previous public meetings, have been refined in several steps with local and expert knowledge as we've gone along. So here's a typical map of one of the variables, and it's a different version of what Andrea showed from her DSAS results and the cross-shore transects. What this represents is shoreline change rates. They do vary from shorelines that are growing seaward, as Andrea mentioned, up in the north, to those that are retreating. So in the hotter colors, if you like here. And here's that table of variables. I've got the little arrow beside the variable. This is just one single thing in a matrix of many. And here's an example of another. Now, these 2 variables combined, shoreline erosion and relative sea level change, are among the more important forcing variables for sea level rise impacts. What the plot or the map on the right shows you is how fast sea level is rising in the region. And the first thing you'll note is that there's areas in the north that are not experiencing the same rates of sea level rise, less rates of sea level rise than areas in the south. And this is a major driver on the shoreline erosion and geomorphology responses we're seeing. So the talk earlier about Centerville Beach and so on, one of the reasons why these are changing so rapidly is because the land is sinking faster than areas in the north. And the reason for this is the proximity to the Mendocino Triple Junction, which gives rise to kind of differential tilting of the Earth's crust. And what's happening then is areas in the south are sinking and areas in the north are emerging. If we look at their vertical land motion, and this was derived from satellite data sets, such that up in the north, the land is rising, but not as fast as sea level is rising. All to say that all areas are experiencing sea level rise. Okay, so these are just two examples of variables. I can't show them all today, but what I do want to show you is then when we take the groups of variables, so what I'm doing here is showing you the first level of one of these categories of vulnerability. So for all these geophysical and biophysical reasons, we have a map averaged by reach of how that parcel is physically vulnerable. And when I say that, I mean in response to just these variables alone. So as we go through the rest of the talk, pick your area of interest, your reach, and track it and see what elements of vulnerability start to pop out. So I've showed you these two maps here, and I'm going to show you the other variables that are listed in the table here. So all of these, and don't worry if you can't take in the patterns, we'll make these data freely available. But the bigger picture in terms of physical vulnerability is the larger map on the left here. So from 10 being very high in terms of physical forcing, so the erosion and sinking of the landscape that I talked about in the south versus areas in the north. So that's what we call the physical vulnerability. And just to give you a sense of the resolution of these data, from left to right are the reaches from north to south, just blown up so you can see your areas of interest a little better. And you can see they're pixelated at roughly 300-foot pixels. And you can, zoom in on your area. And again, these represent the rankings of vulnerability based on these 6 or 7 variables for physical reasons only. Now I want to show you some natural hazards. So this is another type of environmental vulnerability. I'm not going to have time to show you the biological vulnerabilities today. So this is the overall map of natural hazards. So you can see right away, Reach 2 up by the Mad River estuary is very high in terms of natural hazards exposure, as is the Centerville Beach area. And why? Well, if we take all of these 4 variables, so right now I'm showing you the liquefaction hazard. So that's the response of a landscape to shaking by an earthquake that causes soils to become unstable. And then we've got tsunami inundation here as well. So generally low-lying landscapes. So if it's very high, these are areas that could be inundated during a major tsunami. Now, these aren't related to sea level rise, you might be thinking. And of course, they're not. They're independent of sea level rise. They could happen at any time, hopefully not today. But they do indicate areas that are susceptible to other natural hazards. And sea level rise is just one that's very slow and very insidious, but it has with it coastal flooding during major storms and so on that affect the same low-lying areas that tsunami inundation might. And here we have coastal flooding, and this is defined by datums that are defined by the recent California sea level rise guidance by the OPC. And so you can see low-lying areas are more susceptible or more vulnerable, if you like. So when you take all of these variables again, and you put them together and you average them at the reach scale, you end up with this map at the left, and that is just based on natural hazards exposures and sensitivities alone. Okay, and again, this is a map just blowing up your areas of interest, and you can see the different pixels here. So for example, in reach 10 here in the South Spit, you can see that the backside of the barrier is more vulnerable to natural hazards than the seaward side. In part, that's because it's low-lying. It's because the soils are very prone to liquefaction and tsunami inundation and coastal flooding. All right, next we're going to roll this up. So we looked at the 2 first-order vulnerabilities, physical and hazards. Now we're going to combine it with the biological into environmental. This is the bigger picture map here. So look at your areas of interest and see how they score. And this is, I'm not going to break it down into all the submaps, but what I do want to stress here is that any reach has an average score for environmental vulnerability that is the product of 3 things. Okay, so the dark green bars here represent its sort of averaged score in terms of its environmental vulnerability. But then you can break it down. So if you're interested in reach 8 here in the North Jetty, well, why is it environmentally vulnerable? You can see that these other bars in that reach indicate that, and I have a hard time distinguishing between these colors, but our hazards and our biological exposures are high, which is why that reach is high. However, if you go up to, let's say, down to reach 13 at Centerville, you can see that its environmental vulnerability is largely due to exposures to natural hazards and other physical forcings like erosion rates. So we're giving you the granularity, if you like, to dig deep into why certain areas are vulnerable for certain reasons. Okay, so that's the environmental side of things on the left. The socioeconomic things are on the right. So that's the bottom portion of the table here. We've got sociocultural infrastructure components contributing to a broader socioeconomic vulnerability. So let's look at
5 minutes, Ian.
Pardon me, 5 minutes? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so here are two of the variables for sociocultural population density. You can see the values here are a function of the number of people per square mile. We're not showing you the data here, but we're showing you how they rank. You combine that with land use, and you combine that with the locations of cultural sites, which we're not showing, and you end up with the map on the left. Similarly, for infrastructure, and this is the big picture map on the left, so the hotspots for infrastructure are 5, 6, and 7. And they're for these reasons. So emergency response infrastructure, so that's the presence of things like airports, Coast Guard stations, fire hydrants, fire halls, and so on. The emergency response times, the types of roads and transportation networks, and other infrastructure like power lines and pipelines. So when you put all of these together, you get the picture on the left. In terms of socioeconomic, so we're going to roll these two together that we just saw, the socioeconomic picture, as important as the environmental. And again, you can break this down by reach to determine why it is that a certain area is socioeconomically more vulnerable than other areas. So for example, in reach 8 again in the North Jetty, there are sociocultural interests that are almost as important as infrastructure interests that make that socioeconomically vulnerable. And again, with a resolution of about 100 meters or 300 feet. Now, I know this is a lot of information, so what I want to do is walk you up from a single variable to comprehensive vulnerability. Because over time, we've heard from different people, like, well, I know this area is really low-lying and erosion prone. Why isn't it popping up as very vulnerable? And it's like, well, when you look at the picture of 22 variables, there might be 3 that are highly vulnerable, but there's no people there. The barrier width is high, and so on and so forth. So this is population density. We saw this earlier from north to south. And you can see where that sits in the table of things here. If we roll that up to sociocultural, and let's focus in on number 5 here. Okay, so we know the population density for Manila and Samoa are fairly high on the barrier. Okay, and then we've got other interests there. We've got cultural sites, we've got different economic land use classes, and we've got communities. We've got critical infrastructure. We have other, so when we roll those two up into socioeconomic, we can see that these areas in a socioeconomic perspective pop out for all of those reasons: population density, land use, critical infrastructure. Yet on the South Jetty, we don't see that because we don't have the same types of infrastructure and population density and so on. Now, when we roll this all together and we consider the physical factors, the socioeconomic factors together, we get the comprehensive vulnerability map. And as you recall from the environmental exposures, these areas also had some significant concerns in terms of flood risk, in terms of erosion rates, and so on. So that's taking you from a single variable at a high resolution through these different aggregated types of vulnerability up to an overall comprehensive picture. So I hope that's helpful. So the breakdown of it is, and again, all of these charts and data and maps will be available in our final reports and available data sets. But if you look at the big picture and you're interested in reach 6, for example, at Samoa, the reason why it's comprehensively vulnerable, and that's the gray scale here, is largely because of socioeconomic interests. but not negligible environmental vulnerabilities. And again, you can go to any of these reaches and kind of tease apart the picture that way. So in summary then, what we've provided here is a very high resolution, comprehensive assessment derived from multiple variables that describe both environmental and socioeconomic hazards, exposures, and risks. From this, and I'm showing you the comprehensive map of vulnerability on the left here, so that's everything rolled into one. We have areas of low, moderate, and high concern, and I'll let you read through these here. So at a high level then, we can see that areas that have high population density, critical infrastructure, and environmental exposures rank high. And then there are other areas of serious environmental concern, yet because of limited or different types of infrastructure and population density, they don't rank as high comprehensively. That's not to say that these aren't important areas for other interests. So again, the vulnerability approach that we've used here in this multi-level is designed to kind of allow that kind of decision-making and allow that kind of interpretation to say, okay, just because people aren't there doesn't mean that that's not a vulnerable area of concern. So I think with that, I'll leave it there and take any questions there might be. And I can't see anyone, so if there are any questions, you'll have to prompt me.
I'll let you know, Ian. Yes, David.
Thanks for that, Ian. You know, I work for the city of Arcata, and we've done a vulnerability analysis. It was, you know, much less complicated than this. This seems like it, you know, I really appreciate the approach. And I guess I've been sitting here wondering how I could apply something like this in my community that, you know, doesn't kind of raise to the level of, you know, master's or a PhD thesis. Do you have any guidance for, you know, how you can kind of maybe dumb this down in a sense, or simplify it in ways that you know, this multiple variables approach could be used in communities that are trying to develop adaptation planning?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. Again, it's the fire hose effect here. There's so much information thrown out in maps with different colors that it's overwhelming. You know, it's taken us the better part of 3 years to put this together. But I think the easy response is to fall back on this table here and think that, okay, if, for example, the city of Arcata is concerned about flood risk, they need to understand why that flood risk exists. So what is it about the hydrology and geomorphology in an area and groundwater that promotes flooding, and how's that going to change in the future? Where does that happen? So low-lying areas, obviously, but there are other concerns about where, in terms of, you know, if you have a barrier that's protecting your community or your asset or whatever it is you're interested in, and that barrier is at risk due to high erosion rates and land subsidence, so very high rates of relative sea level rise, then you're going to have a much bigger flooding problem on your hands in the future if that barrier goes. And that was really one of the main reasons why I think we were funded and why we were interested in doing this work, is that the barrier itself and how it behaves defines everything behind it. It defines the ability to navigate and use the bays for industry and fishing and recreation. It defines the abilities of the communities and land use activities to be protected from the ocean and storms and storm surge. So again, like I would just encourage everyone to kind of think about teasing apart what is vulnerable, where and why. And in doing so, these maps and, you know, these types of vulnerabilities at different levels can be used to inform that. So for example, what the city of Arcata is interested in terms of, you know, their risks and vulnerabilities is going to be very different than Fish and Wildlife or state parks. But any of those groups should be able to go to this vulnerability assessment and pick whichever levels and types of vulnerability they want to help inform that. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
And again, these maps will be available probably through a web-based GIS, freely available, so that anybody can take a map at a very high resolution and look at where things are the way they are, depending on which either variables or types of vulnerability you're interested in.
Ian, we just have time for one more question. This is from Cal Trout. They asked, does this assessment address future conditions? If yes, how far into the future have you projected sea levels?
Yeah, so we're using the 2018 Ocean Protection Council state guidance on sea level to define the scenarios, for example, for flood risk. So our relative sea level rates and the flood risk maps and variables that we used are directly linked to those, for example. We've also done some fairly coarse simulations in each of these reaches as to where the beach dune barrier systems could exist in the next 50 years or so, using our known data from Andrea's work, as well as like a coupled beach and dune simulation model that moves sediment around. And so that helps inform where we think the shorelines could be. Again, it's a model and it's got some uncertainty, but it essentially reinforces what we already know from the cumulative physical assessment. You know, areas that are eroding quickly now are going to continue to erode and probably erode much more quickly in the future, if that helps.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian. So moving on a little bit from these, oh, I'll share my screen. Give me one moment. Moving on from these presentations, one of the goal of this project is to help increase Humboldt County's capacity to develop resiliency measures to prepare for sea level rise through existing planning and regulatory structures. So it was important that this project came up with a couple of recommendations that we can continue to move forward in our community. So I'm hoping Ian can talk just a couple minutes about some of the recommendations coming out of this project.
Right. Thanks, Kristen. So based on what you've seen from Jeff's work and Andrea's work in the vulnerability assessment, and some workshops that we've held over the years and most recently in Eureka a couple weeks ago, some key themes have emerged in terms of recommendations for ongoing management and response, as well as future adaptation. So first, based on Jeff's work, it's clear that keeping sand within the Eureka littoral cell is key to feeding these shorelines. We don't know, to be honest, where we'll be in 50 or 100 years with the rates of sea level rise we're expected to see. I think it's safe to say that the rates of sea level rise we will see are unprecedented in the past 5,000 to 8,000 years. So these are geologically rapid rates. We're not used to rates of sea level that we will see, and that's just coming. But I think it is safe to say also that with more sand in the system, the beaches and dunes will have a greater chance to restore themselves and be resilient. And I think Andrea's work has shown that nicely. Second, as I mentioned, the vulnerability assessment, again, I apologize for the fire hose of information there, is a very rich tool that allows you to identify where and why things are vulnerable. And again, vulnerability means different things to different people, and this tool allows you to view those different perspectives or a cumulative perspective. And that directly is one of the first things you need to inform your adaptation planning and resilience building. Then this came up in discussions with Sue, who helps facilitate this kind of research to action elsewhere. It's clear that there are a lot of issues that pose challenges for agencies and communities and even landholders for taking action, because a lot of the vulnerabilities that you saw in the maps that we showed are dependent on other things. They're dependent on how certain areas are zoned for land use. They're dependent on the ability to access funding to develop adaptation strategies. And they're dependent on the resilience of natural systems that help provide those natural buffers and protection that we depend on. And that these things vary over a whole bunch of different scales. They vary at the 100-meter pixel scale or the landholding scale, right up to federal scale initiatives that are directing funding to states or counties to help with infrastructure planning, for example. All to say that we're at an era now where we've got the information, we have the science, but now we need the coordination between the communities and counties and the state level to start to bring this into practice and adaptation. Related, land use is a significant factor in defining resilience and risk. And it is something that is tricky to plan and change, given competing interests and giving the processes that counties and municipalities have to adhere to with the state to do something like change land use in an area. There are some tough decisions ahead to be made. Some might require rezoning. Some decisions might require managed retreat or loss of land or change of infrastructure. Some might require hard engineering, et cetera. The point is that a lot of socioeconomic vulnerabilities relate to how land use is defined and how it is managed. Next, we have restoration. So as Andrea's work has shown, nature-based solutions, especially on sandy beach dune barrier systems, are a great way to increase the resilience of the barrier to sea level rise. Over geologic time, barriers have developed in response to changes in sea level, and they will continue to respond and be dynamic. These are inherently dynamic landscapes. They'll want to move up and inland with sea level rise. That's just how they behave. If we can help them be resilient as this happens, then we can't lose. It's not certain whether all of the barriers and dune systems will be able to keep pace with sea level rise, but certainly, and linked back to sand management, if we can keep sand in the system and help these beach dune barriers be dynamic and responsive and resilient, then that will at least buy us time, but in the best case scenarios, continue to provide those ecosystem services and protections that we need. And then finally, and I say this as a researcher, but it was a team thing that emerged, future studies. We do have a wealth of information in front of us now that's been compiled well into this study, but there's certainly a lot more that needs to be done. Jeff has alluded to some examples of information and studies that would be helpful for the sediment budget approach. Andrea and I have identified some in our mapping and in our shoreline response studies, and I'm sure you can think of more. So I think with that, these are the kind of recommendations that have emerged from the study. Of course, we would love to hear more suggestions and feedback from all of you. So please feel free to reach out, and I think Kristen can let you know how best to do that.
Great, thanks, Ian. So in addition to those recommendations, we have some exciting next steps that this project is leading into. So I'd like to ask each of the team members to talk about that in about a minute. So first we'll start with the fact that we have regionally, the project team has obtained additional funding for more dune restoration. So I'm hoping Andrea can speak a little to that.
Sure. Based on the findings from this research project, we were able to attract $14 million in grant funding to do restoration between the Wadush unit of Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge and the Friends of the Dunes property. And that will include monitoring so we can continue watching how restoration affects resilience on a much larger scale than we have before.
Thank you. Next, these results will be incorporated into a Climate Action Fund Dunes Resilience project that Ian's working on.
Yeah, so in the California Budget Act of 22-23, $100 million was allocated by the governor's office to help fund action-oriented solutions to California's climate change and goals, and increasing coastal resilience is one of those. So our team here at UCSB and with some people from the USGS and UC San Diego will be doing a statewide assessment of coastal vulnerability and coastal dunes as a nature-based solution for enhancing resilience. And that will build on some 20 different pilot sites, 3 of which are in the Humboldt Bay area. And as you can imagine, there's very different settings from Humboldt Bay down to San Diego in terms of, pressures on beaches and types of use. So the work that's been done in Humboldt is going to be a major player in this bigger statewide project.
Thanks. Another next step, we're happy that you all joined us today, and we'd like to continue doing outreach on these types of projects. So I'll pass it over to Susie.
So our community outreach will continue moving forward. So Friends of the Dunes is working on updating our website with a lot of these reports from our project partners. That'll be happening really soon. We have free public guided walks that happen twice a month out on coastal properties. Our walk leaders are being educated about the project so they can help share the results of this. We're incorporating it also into our California Naturalist course. So lots of ongoing outreach efforts, and moving forward, we'd like to continue doing more community updates. Next week, we have a public presentation of the Humboldt Coastal Dunes Cooperative, and this is taking place on Wednesday, December 6th from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Humboldt Bay Aquatic Center. 3 out of the 4 presentations next week are updates about dune restoration projects along the coast, including the one that Andrea just mentioned, up from the Wadolph unit to the Friends of the Dunes property, updates about the Ocean Ranch unit down below Table Bluff, and about restoration of the South Spit. So those will be some interesting topics. This is completely free. It's going to be in person at the Aquatic Center, but we'll also be streaming it on Zoom. And that meeting link is available on the Friends of the Dunes website. Kristen just plugged it into the chat. Thanks, Kristen. So yeah, there's lots of ways to get more information, and feel free to reach out to us at Friends of the Dunes if you want to get a hold of any of these reports.
And another next step, continuing outreach to the county and regulators. Sue, would you like to say a couple words about that?
Yeah, so when we started this project, it was one of the things that we needed to incorporate and knew that we could incorporate was we expected that developing information that could be useful to local planning efforts. And given that we were looking at the shoreline along the entire littoral cell. So this and many of the other meetings throughout the project have started that information exchange with agencies through attendance at the various projects over the many years that we've been doing this project. And the counties and with the agencies and the counties and the regulators. And so going forward, we will, as a team, and probably with help from Susie and Kristen as we move forward, we'll be seeking to continue and expand discussion with those agencies and managers as they move forward with updating plans and developing projects in response to sea level rise and taking action. Also, we intend to bring this information to existing ongoing local and possibly state efforts to support a coordinated effort in planning going forward.
Thanks, Sue. So with that, we've gotten a couple questions about when this data or information will be available. So we're anticipating that final reports, as well as a lot of just the data that goes into these reports, we're anticipating it being available early next year. You can get updates from the Friends of the Dunes website, and we're not exactly sure what platforms data sharing will occur, but we'll make sure that it'll be accessible to people that are interested. And with that, we want to say again, thank you all so much for attending. We really appreciate it. And here's some of our project contacts if you have additional questions or need to get in touch about any of the specific data. And Sue, did you have anything else to say? Okay. No. Otherwise, we have 5 more minutes if anybody has any other pressing questions, and we appreciate you all sharing your time with us today.
I see that Roberta Welty has her hand raised.
Yeah, I'm looking at all of this and noticing that nowhere does either HSU or Cal Poly Humboldt be mentioned. Are they involved in this at all?
Does anyone from our project team want to respond to that?
I will. I don't think they have been very involved. I know that for the dune, you know, we were opportunistic in terms of our partners, and we had already been working with Ian Walker early in the project. So you know, that's where that collaboration came from. I can't really say for the other projects.
Thank you. It's just like, it's such a wonderful scientific thing in our community, and I would imagine that the university and our community should get on board.
I will say that some of us are members of the Humboldt Bay Sea Level Rise Institute, and some of this information gets reported there.
Yeah, I would also respond. I know in discussions I've had with Jeff around the sand budget, there has been some discussion of potentially engaging some of the professors perhaps at Cal Poly Humboldt. Look, if we have the opportunity to expand some of that sediment budget work. There's been, he's been engaged in some of those discussions. I don't want to put words into your mouth, Jeff. A thumbs up. Okay. So yes, there is some thought to engaging Cal Poly.
I'll just say as an academic too, I mean, it's not that we're not interested in the potential to collaborate with HSU or Cal Poly Humboldt now. I've never had the chance to be contacted or, you know, really reach anyone there, but I'm definitely open to it. And, you know, we do have some pretty specific expertise on the team as well that doesn't exist yet at Cal Poly. So part of it is when you have a team with the expertise and experience that you need, you run with it. But I think through the Sea Level Rise Institute, there's some really good potential for kind of capitalizing on the people who are there and building on the expertise on our team as we move forward.
Great, thank you all. We have one other question in the chat. I think this will be the last one, but this is a question from Mary. What is the timescale for adding native plants to dunes? Perhaps this is a question for Andrea.
I'm not quite sure what you mean there. What is the schedule for our restoration, the project I mentioned?
Let's start with that one.
Okay, so based on that, we won't be planting into the dunes until 2027, I believe. 6 or 7.
Sue or Susie, did you have anything to add?
No, I was just going to point out there's one more question also a little higher up, probably to Jeff, but from Gary. Is there any effort to model the impact of proposed wind energy infrastructure, extra dredging, et cetera, on the sediment budget issues?
Let me answer I'm assuming the infrastructure will be the infrastructure inside of the bay. The wind towers, once they go offshore, no, that won't have an effect. That's quite a ways offshore, so that won't affect like the dunes or the information you heard today. Within the bay, as the interim planning and the new dredging occurs, yes, they will have to address the sediment budget at some level. And the effect on that. So that's something that, you know, will and likely be upcoming as that project progresses.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your questions, and great job to our project team for the presentations and answering some of these questions today.
Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.